I hope she is.
Yep, I'm good.
Very good. So, welcome to our call. Some thoughts on surveys. I would say, as a conference organizer, sometimes it makes me a little bit nervous when we have one title on the invite, creating an effective survey, and there's another one here. But it falls within the friendly agreement we had. So, good to have you back, Carolyn. Good to see you again. Let me just hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I thought I'd definitely creating the effective surveys is the top of my thought. And I thought because it's a fairly nice group where I hope we'll have some discussion, I just put in one example, and then I hope we're going to have some time for a few questions. So that was my thinking there. So welcome, I'm Caroline Jarrett, and I generally start by asking people to think about what you do for $1. And the reason for that is that I found out when I started reading into surveys, I found a result that I found quite intriguing, which was in the world of paper mail surveys. If you send people $1 in the envelope with the survey, that can have a better effect on the response rate than guaranteeing that they get $10 later. I found that quite intriguing because it seemed a little bit counterintuitive to me. And so that was one of the things that really led me into reading a lot in the survey literature. And in particular, that result to me was best explained by a theory from Don Dillman's books on surveys. And he explains this in terms of social exchange theory, which is to say that people will respond to your survey, or indeed will answer your question on a form, which is why I was interested in it, if they trust you, first of all. So there has to be an element of trust to reveal information. And then within that, it's a connection between perceived effort and perceived reward. So when you get the $1, you have the reward right there. There's no extra effort required in getting it. And of course, some people just pocket the $1 and think, what the heck? But for others, it will say, well, these people trusted me, and they've reduced the effort for me for getting the reward. And it's a mail survey anyway, so you can see, roughly speaking, how much time you've got to put into it. And all of that creates a positive response triangle. So this is a sort of thing I found very interesting. And as you can see from the credit, Jerry and myself actually used that idea in our book on forms, which was published in 2008. And I've been interested in forms and questions because I've worked on forms for over 30 years now. And the whole thing about, well, what can I find out from the literature about why people answer questions, how to get them to answer accurately, because the costs of dealing with forms are absolutely dominated by the cost of dealing with any mistakes that people make when filling in the forms. Very important for me. So I started reading much more extensively in the survey literature to try and find out more, especially from my point of view, because forms are really my thing, about answering questions. And I gradually got into it, and one thing led to another. And I ended up sort of writing a book about surveys, which I guess is why I'm here. And in particular, I found this rather long and formal definition of a survey from one of my favorite survey methodology books by all these people in the credits are kind of heroes in the world of survey methodology. I changed it a bit. I mean, for example, I changed systematic method, which is very formal sort of thing, into process. So I changed some of it into kind of more everyday language that I found worked better for me in normal work, as opposed to gathering statistics for a National Statistical Institute. And my definition really focuses on process and decisions. So I talk about a survey as being a process of asking questions. I mean, there are lots of ways we can find that information these days, but actually getting some questions in front of people, answered by a sample of a defined group of people. A survey is inherently a quantitative method, so we're using it to get some kind of number. And for me, in a business context, I think the reason we are doing or should be doing a survey is usually because we want to make some kind of decision. If we're not going to use that information in an active way, why bother? So that's my definition of a survey. And I think of it as starting with why and who and ending with a number. So in the end, we're going to make some decisions which drives why we want to ask. we need to have some sort of idea of who we're going to ask. We don't just want to ask anyone. We want to know who we want to get that in front of. We've got a process in the middle, and we're ending up with a number. So what's in that process? Well, it turns out that we have all sorts of decisions, and there's a lot to think about in the actual survey itself in the middle. And to make that sort of more memorable for me, apart from anything else, I decided to make an octopus of all the topics that you might have going on. So approximately the left-hand side of the octopus has got all the things about why you want to ask, such as, you know, the reason you're doing it and the questions you ask relating to it. And on the right-hand side of the octopus, approximately, we've got all the things about who. So where are you getting the people from? What sample are you choosing, and so on, bringing them all together. And the reason I made an octopus is because I wanted it all to look really connected. So if we just look at that triangle of whether people respond, we've got the people responding on the right, which is the response, but that tentacle is connected to the reward, which often the reason you're doing it is for some sort of reward, like a feeling of helpfulness towards an organization that you trust. And then the effort really often relates to the questions you ask. So those things are kind of connected across. And if anyone is very keen on octopuses, you'll tell me that octopuses don't have tentacles, they have arms. But I'm pointing out this is not a real octopus, it's a survey octopus, and it has tentacles, believe me. But there's a lot of choices in those tentacles, and bringing them all together is what makes surveys both very interesting and also a very challenging method. So all of those issues are connected. For the purposes of getting through a survey, it's often more convenient to think about a process starting at the beginning and working through to the end. So I've got elements of the process all the way around, the goals of why we're doing it, making some questions that relate to those goals and building them into a questionnaire. These days, we're nearly always administering that questionnaire online, but there are other ways to do it. And then coming up with a response to individual questions, and finally some reports that will go into numbers. And looking on the other side at the people, we're thinking of something about what sample we're going to ask, getting those questions and questionnaires out into the field, as the market researchers call it, and the survey methodologists, so that people can respond, finding out who responds, and then we end up with reports. So in a linear process that's perhaps more convenient, I'm working through from goals and sample to responses and reports. I just focus here briefly on one of the things that can be often quite surprising to colleagues, is that cleaning and analysing the data can often take, you know, just as much time as some of the other elements of the process, particularly if, because of pressure to have a large response, you end up with perhaps thousands of responses. That will take quite a bit of time, and it's something that can be very much neglected. One of the things that is really important, for example, is looking again back at the reason you're doing it and the questions you ask. It does really help if the questions you ask relate to the reasons you're doing it. And sometimes I wonder, I see some surveys and think, what's that got to do with that? You know, it seems like occasionally you get surveys which is like the kitchen sink has been thrown into them, and pruning that back to questions that really just relate to the reason this time. You know, do another survey next week. Don't feel it's got to be a set piece where everything gets asked every time. And similarly, there's errors all the way around the octopus, actually. So one of the best known is probably sampling error, which is an inevitable mathematical consequence of asking fewer than everybody. But there are other errors which are perhaps even more important. So, for example, non-response error happens when the people who do respond to the survey are different from the people who don't respond in a way that affects the survey error, the survey result in the end. And that's a much more technical sort of error, which has to be done by trying it and thinking through and seeing what you're getting. And so we hear less about it. I refer you to my book if you'd like to see all of these errors, but mainly the whole thing comes to be total survey error. And what we end up trying to do to minimize all those errors is to do many things well, and that's why surveys can be quite a challenging method to get right. So, for example, at the beginning, figuring out the questions you need answers to, and then just picking up another thing further on, running the survey is all about making sure people will actually answer and checking out that you're getting a good response rate from the people you ask. And then finally on the right, I'll just pick out, when we present the results, we want to get some useful decisions. And that to me really illustrates the iterative and connected concepts here, in that I was talking about the goal is to make a useful decision at the beginning, and then yet again we've got useful decisions at the end. So the things are very much more connected than perhaps the linear process will show. So I'm a great believer these days in doing lots and lots of little surveys and getting them quick results, and then building up a picture overall from many things. And I just wanted to throw in one example before I throw the floor open to any questions or thoughts that you might have. And so one of these is, I see a lot of, and often colleagues ask me about it, which is this sort of recommend question. Would you recommend us to a friend or family member? You may or may not have strong opinions about it. The intention of that question is for brand tracking in a brand sort of way. So if we imagine a shop selling clothes, the owner of that brand might well want to know whether someone would recommend, oh, I had a great experience with XYZ brand. Where did you get those great shoes? Yeah, I bought them here. That is something that some of us do. And then the original method of that particular question was around comparing numbers at fairly long intervals, only quarterly, not after every single transaction, over time. And in terms of what number do you need to make a decision, then there's some good reasons. So the original method was about intermittently investigating and fixing problems. And I'm afraid to say these days, many of us have heard stories ourselves, or people have mentioned them, of some very bad reasons now, which is I hear of stories where a customer service agent will beg for a score of 10, otherwise they might be punished, which really undermines the whole method. So mostly good, some bad, but they can also be very weird, this question. So, for example, I was mentioning to Janus that unfortunately I was quite ill a few years ago. I'm fine now. But genuinely, when I came out of a hospital ward where I'd been staying for several months, where they fixed me, they asked me whether I would recommend this experience, recommend this to a friend or family member. I mean, really, that made no sense at all to me. I wouldn't recommend it to my worst enemy, frankly. And so it was a very odd thing. And it was clear that someone had said they had to ask that question. Over here, we have the NHS. And there's a thing called the friends and family test, which at that time was on this recommend to a friend. I'm glad to say they've completely changed it now to something much better. And it's sort of incomprehensible what decision they made. So you can tell that it was just like a very peculiar thing. So it's not so much in my mind about saying this is a good question, this is a bad question, this is a good method. It's much more about thinking about your context and your situation, trying it, seeing if it works. And I'm just going to suggest one takeaway before we pause for some questions, which is to say, always try testing your questions by interviewing them in your context. And one of the things I was delighted to find out was the survey methodologists love their testing, even more than we might in the world of user experience. So it's like kind of a little bit of a lightning tour of some of the things I'm thinking about in surveys. And I thought I would now open this up for questions. If anyone had a point, reflection, comments are good as well, and an opportunity for me to hear a bit and perhaps keep the conversation going.
Very good. Thank you, Carolyn.
Oh, I forgot to mention, I'll be sending these slides to Janus shortly, and he'll be circulating them. They're all Creative Commons licensed, so if you'd like to use them for your own purposes, you're extremely welcome to do so. I just ask that you keep the attribution to me. So thank you.
Yes, and I'll share the recording. And I took a few notes as well, starting from what would you do for $1 to your journey from forms to surveys. and a few other things. I see the first question here is from Bernd Burkhardt.
Yes, thanks, Jonas, and thanks, Carolyn, for a good talk. You mentioned asking question, which resonates well to me, thinking about dialogue interfaces. So my question would be, do you think that the form and the dialogue interface would yield different results in the way how people interact with it, and what kind of success your questionnaire would have?
I think that's a very interesting question to think about, how you present the question, whether that has an effect on the way you ask the question. Is that summarize your point correctly, Ben? Yeah, so
excellent.
Technically the survey methodologists call this the mode. So they talk about the mode of the survey as being whether it's presented as a paper questionnaire or by an interviewer, or in these days different types of online technology. And the answer to that is that in my experience, the quality of the question is mostly independent of the mode that you present it in. You know, I'm really much more of a form specialist than a survey specialist. I'm sort of a pragmatist when it comes to surveys. But, you know, my pro tip for many people is that if people are having problems with a badly designed paper form, it's usually because the design is bad rather than it's printed on paper. You know, it's like the questions aren't making sense to people. So you can, if you can make the questions make sense to people, then it can be pretty much technology independent. For example, the question I just gave you about recommend to a friend, it didn't make a lot of difference that I spoke the question rather than it being presented on a piece of paper or on a dialogue of some description. But having said that, you still need to look at the context. So sometimes I put up a slide that says, are you using a PC or Macintosh computer or both? Which sounds like a perfectly reasonable question until someone's answering it on a mobile. And then it's like, no, it didn't make sense anymore. So yes, there are things which are technology effects. Yeah. Another one from many years ago, I mean, I haven't seen this for a long while, but I'm sure there's still some answers coming along, was an example where someone was given the brief to move a form from paper to web. And the first instruction was, please write neatly in black ink. Now that didn't translate too well. So there are some things where we have to think about the technology, but by and large, I think the question and answer process is pretty technology independent.
All right, thank you, Carolyn. So given that you're based in the UK, I thought to just share one thing with you that I'll put in the chat, perhaps also to break the ice if anybody else wants to write something in there. It's a tweet from a fellow member in the community, actually US-based, Dean Barker, who referenced a book by Erica Hall. Actually, her favorite joke in the whole book. Erica Hall wrote a book called Just Enough Research and Conversational Design. Perhaps you've heard of it.
It's very good. I recommend it. Yeah.
And basically, the joke in here, for those of you who don't click the link, says, if you ever think to yourself, well, a survey isn't really the right way to make this critical decision, but the CEO really wants to run one, what's the worst that can happen? And then the next line says Brexit.
Yeah, can we just pause the recording here so I can weep?
Yeah, I didn't intend to go Brexit route, but I was just thinking, you know, on your, I like the approach with trying to minimize the total survey error. And it made me think of this tweet here.
Yes, I think, yeah. My response to the remark probably suggests where I stand on that one politically, but
I was thinking more from a survey.
Yeah, from a survey point of view. I mean, so often I find that people will ask me to look at a survey and they mean the questionnaire, and that's absolutely okay because we do use the terms survey and questionnaire interchangeably. I do it as well, but often I can end up like thinking, oh, well, I'll have a look at this questionnaire, and I start looking at individual questions, and I forget to stand back and say, why are you doing it? You know, what do you really need to learn from here? Because often we can remove or postpone some of the questions to another time when we look very closely at how we're going to actually use the answers.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, being a little bit more serious about the sad political situation that my poor country finds it in, it seems to me that that's a lack of thought about how they were going to use the answer has been one of the problems that's really beset us. Yeah.
And there's that. All right. Any other questions on forms that work, or specifically to this call, survey that work?
Did anyone have any example of a survey that they thought was particularly successful as well? That would be very cool to share with the group.
Yes, I would love to weave that into a blog post as well, if it's a public example. Any brave ones here who's used a survey recently? And thank you, Anke, for jumping in.
It's not a successful survey, but
I think she might have hit the lower hand or mute instead.
can you hear me now?
Now we can, yes.
Okay, must be some delay in clicking. So I cannot share a successful sample of a survey as such, but just a finding of 2 years of pandemic lying behind us. I 4 times a year I do conduct a town hall, and with the town hall in the follow-up there goes a survey. And whenever I did the post-event survey, I found that responses from town hall to town hall started to come in reduced numbers. But when asking and interacting directly during town hall for like the 1 or 2 major questions that the leadership would like to ask, there was a much more willingness to respond. And I think there is a certain, especially in internal comms, a certain fatigue when it comes to survey, because people have been questioned about so many things, especially over the past 2 years, that they tend to not to respond anymore unless it's very low effort exercise.
Anke, that's such a good point. You know, that whole, everyone is very tired of everything, I think, sometimes. I mean, Yannis just shared how much it meant to him to have a couple of weeks of vacation that he badly needed. And I think a lot of people are feeling very tired of everything. And asking them too many survey questions just really does add to that. One of the challenges, I think, for asking that question, you know, very, very good point you made. And one of the problems for all of us is saying, have you seen any good surveys? Is that really a very good survey has a smallest possible sample with the fewest possible questions that can be used to create an effective answer, overall number at the end. And so our chances of seeing a really good survey are much lower than our chances of seeing the normal rubbish that gets bombarded to us thoughtlessly by organizations who are pummeling us with surveys, and that we're all tired of it. And so we tend to see lots and lots of fairly badly designed or very badly designed surveys, and we rarely see the good ones, because the good ones are being very thoughtful about asking the fewest questions of the fewest people to actually get the results. But yes, that whole point about us all being tired and being tired of answering survey questions in particular is one that is a great concern to both market research and survey methodology professions, actually, that response rates have really declined in general, and people are having to pay a lot more attention really to getting decent response rates. Thank you.
And then let me hand over the microphone to Jake, who works with voice.
Yeah, your comments about sort of survey fatigue caught my attention. Sorry I was late, by the way, but I appreciated what you were presenting. There's an organization that I belong to, which I will not name, that occasionally will have me join a call as a consultant, but they also send me requests to participate in surveys 3 or 4 times a week, and I always offer some money. It took me a while to realize this, but there's always a pre-survey. For some reason, every single time I filled out the pre-survey, I was not qualified to take the paid survey. And after a while, just it started ignoring them because I realized, like, hey, the answers to the questions in the pre-survey have some value that they are no doubt gaining, right? Like they're saying, hey, do you use this piece of software? Well, I know a lot about me, what my role is, my title, my, what industry I work in. So I think that's maybe more of a question for someone in my role, which is marketing. And I would love to use surveys, but have not seen a great response from it, to think about the value or the risk in offering somebody something in exchange for completing a survey.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a really good point that for you were being denied any real reward. Like the potential reward was the opportunity to get paid. This is what the part that you may have missed, where I was talking about the balance between people's response tends to be a balance between perceived reward and perceived effort. So you were putting in the effort, but you weren't getting any reward. You were having the potential reward snatched away from you because of not qualifying for the paid for survey, which gets very frustrating. And that organization has shot themselves in the foot, really, because all they've done is train you over a period of time to ignore their survey requests. And I've seen that as well in other research, that at one point I got just a very small qualitative sample. I got 3 people I knew from different roles in life to just systematically collect every survey invitation over a month a few years ago. And I saw them, one friend, for example, who's the most kind and obliging and lovely person. One organization trained her to ignore their survey request forever over the course of that month. That by misusing a survey method, we can alienate our customers and lose the benefit. And in a way, they offer too big of a reward as well. If they're just sent out, one of the things I'm saying to people these days in marketing, for example, is consider sending a small group of customers a question of the week. Like, just send them one question. This week, we'd like to ask you if you prefer purple or mauve. Doesn't matter what the question is, but just a question that they can just ask might train them, or help to train them, that you're not going to be massively intrusive in time. And if you offer them a small reward of any sort, it's like, in honor of you sending the question of the week, we're going to donate 100 euros to the Ukraine campaign or something. It's like, that could be enough to regain their confidence and get them into a habit of knowing that you'll respect their time. That's why these days I'm advocating lots of little surveys, or indeed not doing surveys at all. I mean, Yanis recommended Erica Hall's book. I also recommend it. It gives you a whole raft of different methods, lightly and amusingly introduced. She's a survey skeptic, and actually my book is pretty much, I'm a survey skeptic as well. They're not the method I reach for first, but I recognize they have value, and sometimes they're a useful method to have in our kit bag. But lots of little ones is my current theme, or fewer little ones. Yeah. So great comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. And we are right on the nose here in terms of time. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing from your recent work. I hope we can do another call in the future and keep in touch also on successful surveys. Thank you, Carolyn. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for some great comments and questions. It's been lovely to be here.